The other one we hear, oh yes, there's lots of chemicals. Yes, there are residues, but the amounts are too small to cause any problems. So let's look at this science and deconstruct it. Many chemicals that they will say are safe in parts per million, when they start going down to smaller levels, parts per billion and parts per trillion, start acting like hormones. And they can disrupt our hormone system, our endocrine system. They're called endocrine disruptors. And the science shows that, parts per billion and parts per trillion can cause great damage, particularly to the developing fetus. What is a part per trillion? That is one drop of water in 3 Olympic-sized swimming pools of water. I want you to imagine how small that is. But we know, with research looking at how the fetus develops, is that chemicals in parts per trillion act like hormones. And what these small amounts of hormones do is activate the genes at particular times to start developing the fetus. So the signal to say, now is the time to make eyes or fingers or the brain or our reproductive system or our metabolic system. And if those signals are interfered with, it affects the development of the child. These are known as programming events. And in many cases, they can't be unprogrammed. The child will develop with these problems for the rest of their life. The issue here is that many of these chemicals are approved based on work at parts per million with zero science looking at what actually happens at parts per billion and parts per trillion when they can act as hormones. The fact is, according to the World Health Organization, we have over 800 chemicals that act in this way. And just to explain, the graph up there is the standard model used by our regulatory authorities. It's based on a scientific concept that's more than 400 years old. The dose makes the poison. In other words, what they're trying to say, as you go lower in dose, the toxicity goes lower, and if you get down low enough, it's no longer toxic. It no longer causes any problems. And that's what they work on. However, the new science shows that there are many chemicals. The World Health Organization recognizes over 800 of them, that you get down to a certain low level, and as you get lower, the toxic effect, the damage effect increases. It's called a non-monotonic dose. And this is recognized in the 1990s, and for instance here the US EPA in the 1990s was supposed to act on this, and other regulatory agencies, and as yet not one of the 800 known chemicals has been banned based on this. It's been neglected. But we know these chemicals are causing massive problems. For instance, a lot of them will act like artificial estrogens, and they're strongly implicated in the epidemic of cancers of sexual tissues. And this is breast, ovarian, cervical, endometrial, prostate, and testicular cancers, but also in the reproductive problems. Things like endometriosis now, which is a major silent epidemic that's just starting to get the attention it deserves. all of us probably have friends who suffer from endometriosis, ovarian insufficiency, falling sperm counts, normal sperm, and then urinary genital defects in young children, particularly young boys. And we know in some cases this is due to grandparents' exposure. So the other myth we hear is that the modern chemicals aren't like the bad ones. You know, when Rachel Carson wrote Silent Spring, they said, you know, and they banned DDT. They said the problem with DDT was that it's very residual, long-lasting. The new chemicals aren't residual, they aren't long-lasting, they don't leave residues. Well, if that was the case, if they didn't leave residues, why do we need maximum residue levels for them? Because they leave residues. Yeah. But, you know, and we have to have acceptable daily intakes for them because they're all through our food. And the testing shows most foods and most people have multiple residues. The other thing they say, oh, look, these chemicals, you know, they break down very quickly. And so the assumption is once they break down, they go away, they disappear into nothing. And we can all live happily ever after. They sort of neglect to mention that most of them, when they break down, they actually become more dangerous. So the organophosphates, for instance, and the neonicotinoids, which are the two most common groups of pesticides that are used, when they break down, they are usually 100% to 300% more toxic. In other words, yes, they break down now, they are even worse. And, you know, the most common group now, the neonicotinoids, the ones that are implicated in killing bees in Europe, they're banning them for bees, or each time they ban one, it's a bit like whack-a-mole. The pesticide companies change the chemistry a bit, slightly, put a new name on it and put out two new ones, but they're essentially the same chemistry. But when they break down these neonicotinoids, we know now they're particularly dangerous, particularly for children, and they can cross the blood-brain barrier and cause major damage to the developing brain. And I'll talk more about that because I think this is a huge issue amongst all the different issues. But what is very important is that we know that most of these chemicals form these metabolites. We know actually they're more residual than the actual chemical, and yet there's very little testing for it. And yet where independent testing is done, we can find these residues in our food, in our bodies, and in our urine.